Hello, and welcome back to another video on this channel. Today, I am indeed joined by good old friend Warren Ju Chung, who just got into Cambridge. If you haven't realized, wait for it. We are going to be doing a few videos
Trinity
out of him getting
Trinity
into
College.
Yes, Trinity Cambridge. We are going to be milking this subject to the death in the future, but that is not this day so far. Today, we're going to be talking about is ought. Warren Ju is going to study philosophy at Trinity, so I thought we were going to be talking about this important philosophical concept. Warren Ju, how are you? And also, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm feeling great. Well, Josh told me that we don't have too long of a time today when we're talking, so I thought we could go into a specific philosophical area that I've been thinking about recently, and it is this very famous distinction between is and ought. I think first proposed by Hume, and what Hume said basically is that there is no way to get an ought from an is. That is, we can not get a value of what we can do from what is the case in the world. And I guess my argument against this is ought distinction is that the idea that there's something that is a pure is without an ought is incoherent mostly. It's under a very sort of scientific worldview that we can isolate things into an is. Whereas normally when we perceive things, we don't perceive them as is, and then we try to add the ought on top of it. But I directly perceive the ought within the is. For example, when I let's say when I sit in front of my computer, what I directly perceive is not just the keyboard with all the individual letters scattered on top of it. What I perceive directly, I don't make any inference on top of it, is the keyboard there for me to type on. Therefore, there's no this is ought distinction necessarily, in that I directly see that I ought to do something. I feel the pull of the phenomenon when I see it without sort of seeing the facts. So the is ought distinction maybe works in very limited cases, but there's a tendency for one to push it to cases where it doesn't really apply. Because in our everyday experience, when we return to the phenomenon, so to speak, I don't see how I don't see how our experience is structured with an is and an ought. Rather, our experience is intermingled between them already.
Perhaps to stop you right there, and perhaps to go back a bit and to discuss a bit more about what is and ought. Perhaps we could talk about is ought from the perspective of where it's most situated in, and that is precisely the moral discussion about how moral is perhaps cannot be sectioned into a moral ought, or in fact a moral discussion is precisely the discussion about ought, but is not a discussion about what is. And perhaps there is that kind of the framework in which Hume is writing, which the later people are writing about it. I think it's also G.E. Moore developing the naturalistic fallacy as well in its later distinctions as well. So do you want to talk a bit more about this? Is ought, perhaps, at least in a moral distinction about what it is and perhaps its relationship with Moore and Hume as well?
Yeah, I think, I guess it would be this, that when we're thinking on morals, there's a question of, well, I see that a lot of people are suffering right now. That's a classic case of separating the is from the ought. I see that I'm suffering a lot, and I want to get out of this suffering. However, does this mean that I ought to want to get out of this suffering? Or I ought to want to reduce suffering? I think that's the classic case where one severs the is from the ought. And what I want to perhaps argue is that it's a great sort of logical insight, reflectively, when we analyze sort of the structure of the intention, when we're sitting inside our rooms, we can see that there really is a jump from I want to get out of this suffering to I ought to want to get out of suffering, or I ought to get out of this suffering. However, my argument would be that when we directly observe ourselves in the situation, suffering, I don't see how one can sever the is from the ought when one's directly in the situation. That is, perhaps my argument would be that it is a valid observation that there is this is ought gap, but this is ought gap only. It is not necessarily natural. It is more man-made. It is created when we reflect upon our experience. It does not inhere in experience itself. Whereas in experience, when we're suffering, we directly see that it is good to get out of the suffering without asking ourselves why it is good to get out of the suffering. And a lot of the times, I think the disease is exactly philosophy. People like me, like you, who keep on asking the question reflectively to try to sort of dig into the heart of the matter. When what we get into is really confusion on top of confusion in the Wittgensteinian sense. So I guess that's my argument. We should think
Indeed.
less and act more to get out of this
Indeed.
distinction.
Perhaps to elaborate your thoughts about this a bit more, and I think I understand where you're coming from, and I think it is a very good argument, and perhaps we can discuss like what I think about it in the future in a bit later on in this video. But I think one of the interesting things, or perhaps parallels, would you suggest that the dilemma or the distinction between is and ought is kind of the false distinction, in the same way that you could argue that when we're discussing, like perhaps in Heideggerian terms, ontic and ontological, perhaps there's a similar false distinction such that the ontic is the ontological or the ontological is the ontic, if we are looking at a more of a phenomenological sense, or you cannot actually separate them two. Do you think that that's a similar comparison, perhaps, to if someone is more of a phenomenologist when they're approaching this discussion?
Yeah. Or for Heidegger, it would be ontic maps onto sort of the scientific endeavors. Of course, not exclusively the science, but for him, mainly the science, when he's using ontic in a sort of derogatory sense, compared to his big term ontological. Of course, I guess this distinction is being talked about perhaps almost too much, but just talking about this distinction, because some philosophers would like to say that, okay, whenever they see someone scientifically minded talking about some scientific, I don't know, fact or theory, they're just like, okay, that's the ontic thing. It doesn't really matter. We have to talk about ontological. I don't think that's necessarily the right stance to take either when we're making a distinction, because one can be overly dismissive of science if one sticks to the ontological distinction, where the ontological is sort of it's much better than the ontic. But perhaps what one can say, as you pointed out, is that it is very difficult to separate the ontic from the ontological. That is, perhaps, let's see the work of a scientist when they're investigating the phenomenon. One wants to say that the scientist is trying to be objective and then trying to investigate what just is. But really, when we ask when we see what motivates the best scientists, well, Richard Dawkins even talks about this, about the wonder, when he talks about this a lot. I think I got shown this in a biology class. So I'm taking this as an example of the wonder of exploring the animals, of looking at them, the same as Feynman talked about it, the fun of it all, and also Einstein, who's a slight, I think, pantheist. So I think it's hard to separate the ontological from the ontic, in the sense that one is always motivated by the ontological, or in this sense, sort of this deeper motivation of an awe or wonder, or an ethical, perhaps even deeper than ethical motivation to do certain things in the world. And when one makes the is-ought distinction, one is making the same mistake as one saying that the scientist's job is just to see what is, rather than almost explore and venture on a journey.
If perhaps at this point, I would like to say, well, do you think that this discussion that we've made about the ontic and ontological, and this is perhaps the reason why I raised the ontic and ontological here, do you think that the difference between the two, as we said, or not necessarily a difference, but the relationship between the two is similar, or perhaps mirroring the is and ought relationship that you're trying to raise here, such that they cannot actually be separated? The is and the ought is almost like the ontic and the ontological, tied in together and cannot be separated. Not that there is no difference between the two, but rather that they should be seen as inseparable kind of whole, perhaps, or a synthesis.
I think one can make an argument for that. I think you're right. It's a sense that there are valid categories and valid distinctions that we make, even if one cannot separate the two. It's like an example would be, I have pear here. I was planning on eating it, but you told me to do a podcast, so I didn't eat it. So I have the pear, and I have sort of the skin, and I have the core inside. Of course, they're separate, but as a pear, the two cohere together. So they're separate, but intermingling with each other at the same time. And I think one can make a reasonable argument, and that would perhaps be what I wanted to say when I'm saying that scientists, even when they're investigating the ontic, is still motivated by the ontological, and then the ontic and ontological is mixed together in the same sense as normally the is and the ought is mixed together also, as in when we see a fact, we're already motivated by the fact without doing this a secondary reflective thinking of adding the ought onto the is. Although I think one can also make a case that, let's say, when we're really doing some reflective thinking, we can make these distinctions, but these distinctions are, these distinctions are useful in some in some places, when we're perhaps doing a logical argument and really wanting to get into the weeds of these logical fallacies, but perhaps not so much in real life, or at least when we're returning to real life, they intermingle together. And this intermingling, perhaps one can argue, is the ideal state to strive for. There's a really ancient Confucius idea where and I think this is present in Christianity also, of the ideal mode of being is this integration of all levels of resolution. So in Confucius, there's the very famous book called University, and it's like, what does it mean to get an education? And this education is, I first start from myself. I start from my heart, and I start from my heart goes to my motivation. I go from my motivation to myself. I go from myself to my family. I go from my family to my country, and I go from my country to the world. And there's this integration of all of these levels of resolution together, of me as my heart, my motivation, myself, my family, my household, and my country and the world together in harmony. That makes an ideal state of being. And that is what education should strive for, this integration. And in the same sense, I would argue that that's this integration between the is and the ought, almost this pre-reflective ability to directly identify what is wrong and what is not wrong in the situation at hand, in this Aristotelian embodied sense, is also something that one should strive for. Of course, there's a great thing about reflecting back on it and then separating the is and ought, because it then enables us to question sort of whether the ought that we're deriving from the is valid. However, when we directly perceive, I think one can almost belabor the point too much of this is-ought distinction, to the point that one is afraid of saying anything substantial about anything that is connected with the real world.
And perhaps now we can perhaps move on a bit to our discussion about the is and ought, because I think we've kind of categorized quite well what is ought, and perhaps the preliminary discussion that Warren and I perhaps have about the problem of the is ought. And I think there's two ways we can talk about is ought and perhaps problems of it. One is maybe a psychosociological interpretation of the is ought and why that might be flawed, and perhaps a strict, more logical problem that is ought. And of course, when we hear the naturalistic fallacy or the is ought fallacy or the problem, it's very easy for us to put this logical fallacy there. But it appears to me that it's not necessarily clearly fallacious in the strictest logical sense that you're making a logical fallacy when you are using an is ought. Of course, if you're arguing about an is as an ought, then you could perhaps say that you're using a form of equivocation fallacy, and that's as far you can go. But if you're using it as in a univocal way, and treating the is as the ought, and such that there are no substantial differences. And when I mean substantial difference, I mean like not that they're different, but rather as they are one and the same part of an ethical dilemma. Not that only ought is ethical or only is not ethical, rather that they are both ethical and that they're part of a similar category of discussion. Perhaps you can say that when we're talking about is and ought as one and the same, we are actually not making a fallacious reasoning. But of course, that only makes it into the case when you actually are using the two terms properly in the sense that we have been discussing previously. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, I would say that one is not using a fallacious reasoning in the sense that one is not contradicting oneself when one's adding the ought onto the is, when one does it carefully. However, I think that the critique of the criticism, perhaps, of people adding the ought onto the is that you're almost smuggling in a premise without explicitly stating so. For example, if I see someone suffering, I'm saying it is wrong, that is wrong. It would be natural for us to think that there's a natural jump from the suffering to it is wrong. Whereas we are logically, the deduction wouldn't be justified unless we have another premise of something like it is good to minimize suffering. And then we have the whole thing. And the criticism of the is ought would be that we are slipping in that premise without explicitly stating it out. And well, you can respond to that. And I want to toss out another point that we can discuss. That is the implication. I've been thinking about this. If without the is ought, is that science itself, the investigation into the facts itself, can be an ethical endeavor and can motivate ethics to the extent, because there's a common criticism. It's like, while you're use science, you're only investigating what is, and you're not investigating what ought to be. So we not only we need science, we also need philosophy and everything else for the realm of the arts. And it seems to me that once one collapses the distinction between is and not, there's a space carved out for science, where science itself can investigate values. However, I'm not so certain how this will be, and we can maybe develop onto it after you talk about the logical part.
I think that the logical part is quite simple. I completely agree with you that that is precisely what I was trying to say when I'm saying, well, the is and ought does have a logical problem when you're putting that snug premise in. However, if I think we use is and ought in the more Heideggerian sense that we were discussing previously, perhaps then the apparent distinction between what is precisely a discussion of what already is and ought, such that both terms is and ought are both ontological terms instead of one being ontic and one ontological. If that's one way we can look, and that's how perhaps some people can say, well, that bypasses the logical problem because they're actually both ethical terms in the first place. And I'll try. Do you have any thoughts about that? But before
I think that's a good solution.
Yes. But before we get into the next part, we don't have much time, so we'll only be talking a bit about the is and ought, but we will be talking about science in the future. So if you are interested in a more specific discussion about science, which would take a long time, and Warren knows what I'm going to say, make sure to like and subscribe, because you would not want to miss out that discussion. Because if you watched till this moment, 16 minutes into the video, I'm sure you enjoy this kind of meaningless discussion. So I'm sure you would enjoy watching the next.
Between a Cambridge and Oxford perspective undergraduate. Perhaps here we can see how superior Oxford is to Cambridge, or vice versa.
Precisely. I mean, well, if you're making your uni choices and you're watching this video, you should probably stop watching this video and do some reading. But at the same time, if you're watching this is perhaps the difference between a prospective Oxford student and a prospective Cambridge student. There is quite decent banter between us. But let us continue and talk a bit about the sociological discussion, which I think you're raising quite well. It's precisely that relationship between the is and the ought. And from what you've said, at least in your introduction, what I've heard, you seem to suggest that science as a whole, but let's bring it only to is and ought, that somewhat ought comes from the is. But I'd like to make the case that is comes from the ought in such the way that suffering, we know it is suffering because we know it is bad. It is suffering because it is bad, such that we live first on an ontological level, and it's from that lens in which we view the world, the is, such that when we're saying this is suffering, what we mean already is to say that that is bad. And it's only that we know it's first bad that we call it is that thing, perhaps. And that's perhaps, I think, the more reasonable way to look at it, or at least the way that I think fits best with the worldview that I am approaching or proposing. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I think that's a perfectly valid point, and that's a great insight. However, I also want to point out that to an extent, facts can also inform our values, in the sense that if I found out something about the world, conceivably that fact finding would be able to influence my value judgment. For example, let's say if I found out that a lot of people before me, many of my ancestors were, I don't know, were farmers, and they ate potatoes all day. And perhaps I'm making this ridiculous example because I couldn't think of anything better. Perhaps it would inform my value judgment, in the sense that once I find out that fact, it would change how I value the act of eating potatoes. The act of eating potatoes itself will become something valuable for me in this reciprocal fashion. I think you're right to point out, and there's this reciprocal relationship between the two. And actually, just to go on a side note, it brings back very painful memories from my Cambridge interview, because the first question that they asked me, which I failed completely, was exactly on this question. They're like, well, don't you think, they were talking about Wittgenstein, about sort of, you cannot write any moral sentences. And you're like, well, why don't you think it is wrong to make a baby suffer is a moral sentence? And I got completely stumped on it. But I think you gave the right answer. When I say that it is wrong for a baby to suffer, the use of the word suffer already implies a moral judgment that is not warranted when we want to restrict our realm into the facts. So I guess my answer to you would be that there is this reciprocal relationship, in the sense that, of course, as you said, there's ontological or the ethical informing the the facts, but also the facts can come back to inform the ethical. Although I would like you to challenge me on the second point, because I'm not sure whether it really is valid.
Well, I think that the initial perhaps problem you could see with it is precisely, one could suggest that suffering in this situation, if we're only talking about it from its a factual or scientifical, if that's the limited way we want to talk about it, scientific sense, is precisely we're talking about the pain, the decibels of pain, if that's how you measure pain or something like that. And perhaps you could say that the baby is experiencing pain. And in that sense, you could say perhaps a purely scientific person can make the case that that is precisely and is all that we are experiencing and all we're seeing. I mean, from a psychological perspective, the psychoanalysts would say that that approach to language is itself wrong, but there seems to be at this point a foundational disagreement instead of perhaps a deeper not deeper but a more superficial disagreement. What's at stake here is precisely the roots of the language in which we're using. Yeah. Perhaps what I'm trying, or what we're trying to suggest, is it is precisely the usage of language. The usage of language is created from its meaning, the ethical substrate underneath it's found. Humans fundamentally start from meaning before they build facts, whereas someone else might say humans fundamentally start from facts and then build upon meaning. And it really depends which way you're going from, even though I personally think an evolutionary way actually suits the meaning instead of in some sense, the science supports the meaning approach. But I think that it's this fundamental dichotomy is perhaps the only objection you can have here, because I don't see how you can find if human starts with meaning, you can find an internal contradiction or inconsistency with the system or the reasoning we've just built.
Yes, and just to follow on of this meaning thing and its relation to language, one can consider, I think, a very simple observation in natural life. It's like when someone is speaking, you normally presume that what they're saying is of substance. And when you realize that they're speaking gibberish, you're like, what the hell? Why the hell are you saying that to me? When you realize that what they're saying is irrelevant to your aims. So in this sense, every single word that we're saying, we presume, or every single word that we're saying, we presume that it has value for other people. And every single word that others say to us, we presume that it has value to us, or else we won't listen. So in this sense, every single linguistic utterance is already saturated with meaning and value judgments, or else it wouldn't be uttered at all. And taking this back to the biological case, actually, I think scientists don't talk about pain when they're being very specific. They talk about, I think, narcoreceptor stimulation, and they don't, because they don't want to sort of link themselves onto the value side of things. And I think the really interesting question here, after we've established this reciprocal relationship between value and facts, is should science be informed by value, or should it be such a pristine science in the sense of we can only talk about narcoreceptors rather than talking about pain? And because in this sense, there's a sense in which I think science ought to talk about value as well as facts, if it is to be something that is of value to everyone. But
and I might interrupt you right there. I think you have been, as always, very prescient in the sense that you have seen what I wanted to discuss in my next video. As we have established, I am indeed running low on time, and perhaps we could end off this discussion by giving an analogy. If Warren G started talking to me and I only responded to him by 2 + 2 = 4, of course, there's a great Russian idiom 2 + 2 = 5. But if I constantly responded by saying 2 + 2 = 4, he'll probably leave the call pretty quickly. That is a fact, but it doesn't have meaning. And perhaps that's a good thing where we can end off. You can perhaps, before we do post our video about science, also think about, should science also take into consideration the ought, the value, the ontological realm, as well as the ontic realm of what it's proposing, and see what actually is the purpose of science. What does it mean to live a scientific life? I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, like always, make sure to like and subscribe. It really means a lot to me. It really helps this channel grow. We have been growing our subscribers really, really quickly of late. I don't even know how that's possible, but we have indeed hit 571 subscribers.
Because of Cambridge and Oxford. Because of Oxford.
Exactly. I think that is indeed the case, perhaps. But I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, my friends. And goodbye. I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe and God bless.